a millionaire rescued a young girl begging on the streets and took her into his home. Years later, he was stunned to learn who her real father was. The young girl, only 7 years old, wandered alone through the streets, her bare feet caked in mud, and her tiny, frail body wrapped in torn, dirty clothing. Her tangled hair fell across her face, and her large, expressive eyes held a weariness that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. Kidnapped from her family but managing to escape, she now drifted without a home. Each day, her humiliation seemed to grow. People passing by muttered cruel things without knowing who she was or what she'd endured. "That child has probably never seen water," a man whispered to his wife, walking past Laurie and covering his nose with a look of disgust. "What a filthy creature," the woman responded, looking away. Laurie, young as she was, could feel the sting of their disdain. She tried to hide, curling up in the shadows, but their words cut deep, leaving scars on her heart. On one of the coldest days, Laurie sat in the corner of a park, trying to keep warm. She watched from afar as children laughed and played with their parents, carefree and happy. She approached with a glimmer of hope on her face, but soon a horrified mother pulled her children away, warning them loudly not to go near. "Stay away from her," the woman said, eyeing Laurie as though she were a threat. The children sneered at her, their laughter mocking her appearance. "She looks like a monster," one of the kids yelled, and the others joined in, mimicking him, leaving Laurie's cheeks burning with shame. She tried to ignore them, but when an older child threw dirty water on her, she felt utterly defeated. She felt like less than nothing, a nuisance that everyone tried to avoid. Many times, she would ask for food at local restaurants, only to be met with cold stares and a firm, "Go away. This isn't a place for beggars." Once, when she asked just for a piece of bread, an employee shoved her outside, calling her a disgusting brat. Laurie fell to the ground, tears streaming down her face, but she got up, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her torn dress, knowing she had to keep going. At night, the cold cut like knives, and with nowhere to sleep, Laurie curled up in a corner, lying on pieces of cardboard she found in the trash. One night, a group of teenagers passed by and noticed her sleeping on the ground. Seeing her there, they started laughing. "Look, a homeless woman pretending she's got a bed," one of them mocked, while another kicked the cardboard she was lying on. Laurie jolted awake, her heart pounding, feeling a wave of fear and sadness wash over her. She tried to curl up even tighter, but the teens only laughed more and eventually left, leaving her shivering from cold and fear. Despite all the rejection she faced, Laurie held on to a tiny hope that someday someone would truly see her. She longed for a home, a warm bed, and most importantly, someone who cared about her. But, for now, her world was a cycle of cold, hunger, and disdain. Each morning, she would get up and wander the streets, hoping for something better. Yet each insult and slammed door made that small flame of hope grow dimmer. On one particularly tough day, she met Edward. He was walking through the plaza, where she tried to keep warm under the weak sunlight, huddled in a corner. When he spotted her, he stopped. There was something in his eyes, a mix of kindness and compassion. He watched her from a distance, seeing the sadness in her face and the way she sat, curled up like someone who had endured far too much for a child her age. Edward approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her, and crouched down to her level. "Hey, little one. What's your name?" he asked with a gentle smile. Laurie hesitated, but sensed something safe in his tone. She whispered her name so quietly he could barely hear. "Are you here all alone, Laurie?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, lowering her head, unsure of what to expect. Edward felt a deep sadness, seeing how such a young girl carried such a heavy burden. He knew he couldn't leave her there, alone, and looked down upon by everyone. "Would you like to come with me? I have a big house, food, and a warm room. You don't have to stay here anymore." Laurie looked up at him, feeling a glimmer of hope ignite within her. It was hard to believe someone genuinely cared, but there was something in his eyes that made her want to believe. With a mix of fear and a joy she hadn't felt in a long time, Laurie nodded. She took his hand, feeling safe for the first time. That day, Edward brought her to his home, giving her new clothes, food, and above all, showing her that the world could be a kind place. Each day, he helped her let go of the pain and shame she had carried for so long. Under Edward's care, Laurie blossomed, transforming from a frightened child of the streets into a joyful girl, ready for a fresh start. It was a radiant day, and as the sun slowly set, its golden glow cast over the yard of Edward's luxurious home. Laughter and joy filled the space where the wealthy man played with his 12-year-old daughter Laurie. They were a close-knit, loving family, and each moment Edward shared with Laurie felt like a priceless treasure. "Dad, catch me," Laurie called out, dashing across the garden. Her long brown hair flew in the wind, and the happiness on her face was utterly contagious. Edward chased after her, his footsteps heavier compared to Laurie's light, quick ones. "I won't let you get away that easily," he laughed, their fun filled with pure delight. In that moment, the outside world felt distant and unimportant. As they played, Edward glanced around and admired the beauty of the day. The sky was a deep blue with puffy white clouds scattered across it. Flowers bloomed all around, and their fragrance mixed with the scent of freshly cut grass. "Look at these flowers, Laurie. They're so beautiful today. Can you count all the different colors?" he asked as she paused to admire the garden. "Let me see. There's pink, yellow, purple, and... oh, there's white too," she replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "And I love how they dance in the wind," she said, waving her hands to mimic the flowers' gentle sway, bringing a warm laugh from Edward, who admired her imagination. With a smile, he decided it was time to give her a special gift. He had bought a heart-shaped necklace, a symbol of his love for her, and he was certain she'd adore it. "Laurie, come here. I have a surprise for you," he called, his heart racing with anticipation. "A surprise? What is it?" she asked, running toward him, bubbling with excitement. "Close your eyes." Taking her hands, Edward instructed her with a playful sparkle in his eyes. Laurie complied, her curiosity building. He guided her into the living room, where the gift lay wrapped in colorful paper with a silver bow. "You can open your eyes now," Edward said, smiling as he watched her expectant expression. Laurie slowly opened her eyes, and as she spotted the gift, her face lit up. "Wow, Dad, what is it?" she exclaimed, her hands trembling with excitement as she tore into the wrapping. As the paper fell away, she revealed a stunning necklace. A golden heart with tiny diamonds sparkling in the sunlight streaming through the window. "Oh, it's beautiful. It's amazing," Laurie gasped, her eyes shining brighter than ever. "Can I wear it now?" "Of course, sweetheart. This necklace is a symbol of my love for you. Each time you look at it, remember that I'll always be by your side, no matter what happens," Edward said, his voice filled with emotion. He helped Laurie fasten the necklace around her neck, and she touched the pendant with delight. "Thank you, Dad. I'll take care of it just like you take care of me," Laurie promised, wrapping her arms around Edward's neck in a tight hug. He held her close, feeling the warmth and innocence of his daughter's love. These were the moments he cherished most in life, simple, yet so meaningful. After a few moments of affection, Laurie led Edward back to the yard. "Let's play tag. I want to see if you can catch me this time," she challenged him, her eyes gleaming with mischief. Edward laughed, his heart light. "Watch out. You don't know who you're up against. I'm the best tagger there is." And with that, they launched into a new game. Laurie darted across the grass, weaving between trees and flowers, with Edward close behind trying to catch her. Their laughter filled the air, and their happiness was tangible. Time seemed to slip by as they played, and Edward couldn't imagine being anywhere else but there, with his daughter. But as the afternoon wore on, the daylight began to fade. With the sun nearly set, they decided it was time to head inside. "Laurie, how about we help Mom in the kitchen?" Edward suggested as they made their way to the house. "Yes, I love helping with dinner," Laurie replied, skipping with excitement. As they entered the kitchen, the delicious aroma of Camilla's cooking surrounded them. "Hi, honey. How was the game?" Camilla asked, smiling at the sight of them together. "It was amazing. Dad gave me a beautiful necklace," Laurie said, twirling around to show off the pendant around her neck. "Look, Mom." Camilla leaned closer, admiring the necklace. "What a lovely gift. Always remember how much your dad loves you, sweetheart." She placed a hand on Laurie's shoulder. "Now let's get dinner ready. How about you make a salad?" Laurie eagerly agreed and began washing the vegetables, recounting stories from their playtime. Meanwhile, Edward set the table, thinking about how grateful he was for his family. Every laugh, every glance, every shared moment was a gift he didn't take for granted. After dinner, Edward and Laurie settled on the couch to watch a movie together. The atmosphere was warm, with the scent of food lingering in the air. The movie began, and Laurie was thrilled, deeply engrossed in the story, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "This is my favorite, Dad. You're going to love it," she said, cuddling up beside him. Edward smiled and hugged her, feeling a comforting warmth from her closeness. "I'm sure I'll love it, especially since I'm watching it with you." And so they spent the night, wrapped up in the movie, laughing and commenting, as if the world outside was distant and safe. However, as the night went on, a subtle unease began to grow inside Edward. When the movie ended, Edward kissed his daughter on the forehead. "Good night, my love. Remember, I love you more than anything in this world," he said, looking into her eyes. "I love you too, Dad. You're the best," Laurie replied before heading off to her room. Edward felt grateful, but a knot of worry formed in his stomach. He brushed it off and prepared for the next day. With a final glance at Laurie's room, he went to bed. But the uneasiness stayed with him. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the window, filling the house with warmth and the promise of a new day. Edward woke up feeling eager, looking forward to spending more time with his daughter. He went downstairs for breakfast, expecting Laurie to join him. But when he reached the table, she wasn't there. "Laurie, sweetheart, are you up?" Edward called, but there was no reply. He looked around, his heart beginning to race. "Laurie!" he shouted, a growing sense of panic tightening in his chest. He went through each room, calling her name, but silence filled the house like a heavy blanket. When he finally entered Laurie's bedroom, what he saw made his heart stop. The bed was neatly made, but her absence was all too real. A note lay on the pillow, and Edward felt a chill down his spine as he approached. With trembling hands, he picked up the paper and read the words that would change his life forever. "We have your daughter. You will never see her again." An involuntary cry escaped his lips as his mind spun in a whirlwind of horror and disbelief. How could this have happened? Where was Laurie? Edward's world, once filled with love and joy, had turned into a nightmare. He felt the necklace he'd given Laurie around his neck, now a cruel reminder of the happiness that seemed so distant. "No, this can't be," he shouted as desperation took hold. He needed to act. He needed to find his daughter. Edward knew that every second counted, and though his mind raced with questions, one thing was clear. He wouldn't rest until Laurie was back in his arms. As soon as Edward clutched the note left on the table, his heart sank into a pit of despair from which it seemed impossible to return. With shaking hands, he grabbed the phone and dialed the police, every passing second stretching into unbearable torture. "My daughter! They've taken my daughter! Please, come quickly," he pleaded, his voice choked with panic. The silence in the house, once filled with Laurie's sweet laughter, now became oppressive. A hollow void, echoing through every corner. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Red and blue lights reflected off the house windows, signaling the arrival of the police. The investigation team entered, their serious expressions adding to the tension that hung in the atmosphere. "Mr. Edward, we need you to tell us everything you know," one of the officers asked, his tone firm yet sympathetic, aware that each second lost could mean the difference between life and death. Edward took a deep breath, struggling to piece together the chaotic thoughts racing through his mind. "She was here when I left for work," he managed to say. "She was still asleep. It was early," he continued, holding up the crumpled note in his hand, his voice catching in his throat. "She was wearing the necklace she swore she'd never take off." The memory pierced his heart. The police searched the house and nearby areas, their flashlights scanning dark corners in hopes of finding any clues, while Edward's anxiety grew with every unanswered minute. In the following days, interviews and intense searches blurred together. Media outlets quickly picked up the story, and Laurie's picture, with her bright smile and her face framed by chestnut curls, appeared on front pages and TV screens. Edward appeared at every press conference, pleading for information. "Please, if anyone knows anything, please come forward. My daughter is everything to me." His voice trembled with each plea, the dark circles under his eyes revealing countless sleepless nights. Weeks went by, and the search began to lose momentum. The investigators stayed in touch, but leads became scarcer, gradually going cold. Edward rejected words of comfort and the subtle suggestion that maybe it was time to move on. "No, she's alive. I'm sorry. You have to keep looking," he insisted, his determination mingling with the despair in his eyes. Yet the world around him seemed to move forward. Edward remained frozen, reliving the last day he saw Laurie. Every night, he would sit on the living room couch, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the moment it would swing open and Laurie would run in, arms wide, smiling brightly. Memories played of them, laughing in the yard, of her jumping into his arms and giggling at his stories. The necklace he'd given her as a symbol of protection now served as a painful reminder of his failure to keep her safe. Time passed, cutting away at his hope, like a sharp blade. Camilla, his wife, couldn't bear the weight of their shared grief. One day she left, leaving Edward alone in a home that felt emptier with each passing day. "I can't take it anymore, Edward. The emptiness is killing me," were her final words before she closed the door. Edward sat in silence for hours, listening to the echo she left behind, a silence that seemed to scream the truth he couldn't bring himself to face. 8 years had passed, but for Edward time had lost all meaning. The home that once echoed with children's laughter had transformed into a silent shrine to loss. He had aged visibly, his once brown hair now entirely grey, and the lines etched into his face told stories of countless sleepless nights and endless tears. Friends who once surrounded him had slowly drifted away, unable to bear the relentless sadness that seemed to cling to him. He never moved on from the loss. People whispered, not realizing that Edward heard every word, each one cutting deep. On every one of Laurie's birthdays, Edward would place a cake on the living room table and light a candle. He'd sing, "Happy birthday to you," in a trembling voice. Each note heavy with memories of his little girl. It was a sad, lonely ritual, but a necessary one, a way to keep alive a hope that others had long told him to let go of. "I'm still here, Laurie. I'm still waiting," he would murmur to her photo, his hand brushing against the necklace that sparkled in her memory. Then, one cold, starless night, Edward returned home after a long day at work. The wind howled outside as though trying to warn him of what awaited. He shut the gate with a heavy clang and sighed deeply before climbing the steps to his front door. As soon as he opened the door, a wave of unease swept over him. Something felt wrong. A shiver ran down his spine as he paused, staring down the dark hallway, stretching before him. The familiar scent of the house, mixed with the faint smell of old wood, felt thick with a strange tension. Edward flicked on the light and was stunned to see the living room in chaos. Papers lay scattered everywhere, as if a storm had torn through. Overturned furniture created a maze of disorder, with broken objects littering the floor like fragments of shattered memories. His heartbeat quickened as panic gripped him. He heard a noise from the back, maybe a creak of old wood, or perhaps something else. "My home was broken into," he whispered, his voice sounding distant, the echo of his words vanishing into the silence. He took a hesitant step, feeling the floor creak beneath his feet, and began to walk through the room, trying to take in the damage. Each step seemed to tighten the weight on his chest, his mind spinning with unanswered questions. Who could have done this? Had anything valuable been taken? But when his gaze was drawn to a faint glint near the fireplace, everything else faded. There, in the dim light, lay a small, familiar object that made his heart skip a beat. Edward kneeled down, hardly breathing, and picked up the heart-shaped necklace. It was the very one he had given Laurie, the same necklace she'd been wearing the day she was taken 8 years ago. The world around him seemed to pause. Time itself felt suspended, locked in a moment of aching hope and agony. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating, and tears welled in his eyes, trembling on the edge, before rolling down his face. "Laurie." His voice cracked into a whisper, barely audible, filled with pain and a trace of hope he thought he'd lost. The cold metal against his fingers brought a flood of memories. Her smile when she first opened the box, her eyes shining as she promised never to take it off. Edward's mind was a storm of emotions, hope, fear, anger and confusion, all clashing within him. How had that necklace ended up here? What did it mean? Was it a warning, a clue, or just a twisted trick? He clutched it tightly against his chest, the sharp edges pressing into his skin, grounding him in reality. This was no illusion born from desperation. The faint sound of a car passing by pulled him back to the present, a reminder of how exposed and alone he was in the darkness of his broken home. Slowly, he stood, the necklace still gripped in his hand. His gaze drifted toward the partially open window, where the curtains fluttered gently in the chilly breeze coming through. A shiver ran down Edward's spine, and it wasn't just the cold. There was an unsettling feeling that he couldn't shake. Was someone watching him? The silence in the house felt heavier, filled with an unfamiliar tension that hadn't been there in years, almost suffocating him. He took a step toward the window, then froze. Doubt held his muscles captive. If this necklace was a sign that Laurie was alive, he wouldn't stop until he found her. If it was a trap, he would find out who was toying with him and why. Edward knew that the search for his daughter was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was starting all over again, with the same intensity and heartache from 8 years ago. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the dampness of tears mixed with the roughness of his unshaven beard. "I won't give up on you, Laurie," he whispered, the promise rekindling within him with renewed determination. He glanced around the ruined living room, memories of countless sleepless nights waiting for her to walk through the door flooding his mind. The necklace in his hand was proof that something was happening. Edward took a deep breath, wiped his eyes, and knew that tonight, more than ever, he had a reason to fight again. With hands still trembling, he reached for the phone and called the police station. The dispatcher's voice sounded flat and weary, but when he mentioned the break-in and the necklace, her tone became serious. Soon 2 officers arrived at his house, examining the scene and taking the necklace as evidence. Edward explained the significance of the object, his eyes glistening with tears, his voice breaking. "It's all I have left of her," he spoke, feeling each word pierce through his chest like a dagger. The officers exchanged glances, clearly grasping the gravity of the situation, before they said their goodbyes and promised to investigate. Once the police left, Edward felt the heavy weight of solitude settle back into the empty house. He needed support, someone he could rely on. He picked up the phone and dialed Stephen, his trusted employee for more than a decade. The phone only rang twice before Stephen answered. "Mr. Edward, is everything all right?" Stephen's voice was calm, but full of concern. Edward took a deep breath before he replied. "Stephen, I need you here. Something significant has happened. The house was broken into, and I found Laurie's necklace." Silence filled the other end of the line, and Edward could almost hear Stephen swallowing nervously. "I'll be right there, sir." Afterward, Edward called Raymond, another reliable employee known for his discretion and efficiency. Raymond answered immediately. Without delay, Edward said, "Raymond, there was a break-in here. The police have been informed, but I need your help to understand how this happened. And there's something else. Laurie's necklace was found." Raymond's usually composed voice faltered for a moment. "I'm on my way, sir. I'll be there in just a few minutes." While waiting for his employees to arrive, Edward sat on the couch, which once brought him comfort, but now felt like a throne of thorns. The presence of the necklace, now held as evidence by the police, pulsed in his mind, a constant reminder that Laurie's mystery was far from solved. He stood up and walked to the window, peering into the darkness outside, almost hoping to catch a glimpse of a clue, a movement that might reveal the intruder. Minutes later, the sound of a car pulling up broke the tense silence. Stephen and Raymond arrived together, their faces serious, their eyes sharp. Stephen was the first to speak. "Sir, we'll handle this. What else do you know?" Edward ran a weary hand through his hair. "Nothing beyond what I told you. They took things, but left the necklace. This is no coincidence." Raymond nodded, scanning the room with a keen gaze that searched beyond the obvious clues. "We have to figure out why they left this necklace here and what it means," he said, his voice steady and resolute. Hours later, as the three of them discussed their next steps, Edward heard the low murmur of the TV on the news channel he'd left playing. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. "Another upscale home was broken into tonight. Police suspect it's the same gang responsible for a recent string of burglaries." A chill ran down Edward's spine. The mention of another break-in that same night added an urgent edge to their situation. "This can't be a coincidence," Stephen said, his voice heavy. Raymond watched Edward, waiting for direction. "We need to get to the bottom of this quickly," Edward said, determination replacing his earlier anxiety. He looked over at Raymond, who was silent, his gaze fixed on the ransacked room. Edward recognized that look, a mix of old pain and silent understanding. He stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. "Raymond, I know this brings back difficult memories for you. You also lost your daughter when she was young, and you never found out what happened to her." Raymond looked away briefly, taking a deep breath before meeting Edward's eyes again. "Sir, when I saw that necklace, it stirred the same pain I felt when I lost my daughter. It's a wound that never heals, but I can only imagine how finding something so personal after all these years must hit even deeper for you." Raymond's voice trembled slightly, a rare display of emotion in someone usually so composed. Edward nodded, feeling a strong connection with the man who had helped him countless times, but whose tragic past he rarely touched on out of respect. "Raymond, no one understands this like you do. That's why I need you now more than ever. We have to figure out what this means, and if Laurie could still be alive." The mix of desperation and hope in Edward's voice was clear, and Raymond felt his determination surge alongside Edward's. "Do whatever it takes, Senor Arello," replied Raymond, his eyes hardening with an unspoken vow. "We'll pick up where the police left off. If this necklace was left behind, someone wants you to know something, and we'll get to the bottom of it." Sensing the heavy tension around them, Stephen placed a firm hand on Edward's shoulder. "Sir, we need rest. Pushing ourselves like this won't help. Tomorrow, with clear heads, we'll be in a better place to figure things out." Raymond nodded, though worry still lingered on his face. Edward took a deep breath, hesitant to admit it, but he knew Stephen was right. "Fine, we'll get some rest. We'll start fresh in the morning." The two men left the house, leaving Edward alone in a silence that seemed louder than any noise. The cluttered room and the memories it stirred made it impossible to settle down. Thoughts of the necklace, Laurie's absence, and now the news of yet another robbery pounded relentlessly in his mind. He glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. An idea took hold of him, sharp and persistent. Without another thought, he grabbed his coat and headed out with determination. The night was cold, the wind biting against his skin. The empty streets were dimly lit by the occasional street lamp, casting long, eerie shadows. Edward knew the location of the house that had been robbed earlier that night. He was familiar with the owner from social events and business gatherings. The walk felt longer than usual, each step filled with anticipation. Finally, the mansion came into view. Even in darkness, it was an imposing sight. The lights were still on, and a police car parked at the entrance indicated the investigation was still underway. Edward hesitated for a moment. His heart raced. "What am I doing here alone?" he wondered, but his need for answers overpowered any sense of self-preservation. He took a step forward, his mind buzzing with questions. If there was any clue here that could lead him to Laurie, he would find it. Edward approached the house, fully aware that he was about to cross a line that could change everything. He took a deep breath and knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoing in the silent night. For a moment nothing happened. He almost convinced himself to go back home. But just then, a light flicked on inside the house, and hurried footsteps echoed from the other side. The door opened just a crack, enough to reveal a middle-aged man with tousled hair and wide eyes filled with worry. "Who are you? What are you doing here at this hour?" The man's voice trembled, heavy with suspicion. Edward raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Sorry for coming by so late. I'm Edward Mendes. I was robbed too. I needed to speak with you to see if you found anything or saw something that might help." The homeowner blinked, his expression easing slightly as he recognized Edward's name, well known in town. "Come in," he said, opening the door a bit wider to let Edward enter. The living room was in disarray, mirroring the chaos Edward had left back at his own place. The man ran a hand over his face, still visibly shaken. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I did see one of the thieves." Edward held his breath. Every word the man said felt like a potential clue. "You saw them? Who was it?" The man looked at Edward with weary eyes and whispered, "It was a girl. Couldn't have been more than 20. But the way she looked at me, there was something different about her. A resolve I'd never seen before. A chill ran down Edward's spine. A girl, a young woman mixed up in the robberies. His mind started racing, piecing things together, considering the implications. Could there be a connection to Laurie? Or was this just the beginning of something far bigger? Edward stayed silent for a moment, taking in what the man had just revealed. It seemed like a small detail, but to him, it was a glimmer of hope in the midst of chaos. A girl. "Are you certain?" Edward's voice came out louder than he intended, carrying a mix of urgency and disbelief. The man nodded, his eyes lost in a memory that clearly haunted him. "Yes, it was a young girl. She had her hood pulled up, but I managed to catch part of her face when she turned. Her eyes were striking, cold, like she was prepared to do whatever it took. She looked like she knew exactly what she was doing. And for a moment, she looked right at me, almost daring me to act." The memory clearly disturbed the man, who shuddered. Edward felt a chill run up his spine. It was an odd, familiar feeling, as if he were on the verge of uncovering something important. "Did she say anything? Anything that might help me understand her motive?" Edward leaned forward. His eyes stayed locked on the man's face, silently pleading for more details. The homeowner shook his head, his hands trembling as he rubbed them together. "No, she didn't say a word. She was with 2 other men, and they all moved quickly, like they knew they didn't have much time. When one of them started rummaging through the drawers, she just looked at him and gave a quick nod, as if she were in charge." It was unsettling. Edward absorbed every word. His mind was beginning to piece together a puzzle, though it still didn't make sense. The idea of a young girl leading a robbery, somehow leaving Laurie's necklace at the scene, seemed absurd. But he couldn't ignore the connection. That girl. "Is there any other detail you can recall? Scars, tattoos, anything unique?" Edward pressed, his voice cutting through the silence of the room. The man closed his eyes for a moment, as if reaching deep into his memory for any additional clue. She had a lighter streak of hair, almost blonde on the right side. But that's all I saw before she disappeared with the others. They vanished into the night before I could do a thing. I was frozen. "I'm sorry." Edward placed a hand on the man's shoulder, an unusual gesture of empathy, given his own inner turmoil. "You've already helped me more than you know. I'm going to find out who she is and why she left this necklace. Thank you." Edward turned to leave, the necklace still hanging from his fingers, his mind racing with questions and theories. He knew sleep would evade him, with this new information pounding in his head like a relentless drum. The door behind him closed with a heavy thud, and Edward walked along the empty sidewalk. The chill of early morning clung to him like a second skin. The wind howled, carrying a faint, almost ghostly moan that seemed to echo his unease. As soon as he reached his car, he slid into the driver's seat, gripping the necklace tightly. The cold metal pressed into his warm palm. "Laurie, where are you?" he whispered, his words disappearing into the silence of the car. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting memories flood him. Laurie's laughter, the way she hugged him when she was happy, the sparkle in her eyes when she first gave him that necklace. The sudden buzz of his phone startled him. With shaky hands, he answered, "Mr. Edward, it's Stephen. The police will be back early tomorrow to investigate further about the necklace." "We need you to be there," he added. Edward took a deep breath, trying to steady his mind. "Yes, Stephen, I'll be there. But I need you and Raymond to come as well. I have information that could change everything." Stephen paused briefly before responding. "Of course, sir. We'll meet you there. Take care tonight." Edward ended the call and looked at the necklace again. It was a small clue, but the only one he had in years. His heart pounded with a mix of hope and fear. Why had someone brought the necklace back? Was it a message, a warning, or worse, a trap? He started the car and headed home, but the drive felt longer than ever. Every turn, every shadow cast by the streetlights seemed to hide answers just beyond his reach. Edward knew that tonight was only the beginning of a new search, a journey he'd never expected to undertake. The next morning, Edward met with Stephen and Raymond in his office, a place that once radiated calm, now thick with tension. The first light of dawn was just breaking over the horizon when the three men gathered, each wearing a look of worry and the fatigue of sleepless nights. Edward rose from his chair and started pacing back and forth. The necklace still dangled from his fingers, a constant reminder of what weighed on his mind. "I went to the home of the other man who was robbed," Edward began, his voice steady but laced with weariness. Stephen and Raymond exchanged quick glances before focusing on Edward. "He told me he saw one of the thieves, a young person, a girl." The silence that followed seemed to thicken the air around them. Raymond's brows knitted as his fists clenched reflexively. "A girl? That's odd, Edward. But why do you think this has anything to do with Laurie?" Edward stopped his pacing and looked at Raymond, his eyes a mixture of hope and fear. "Because he described someone young with a strand of light-colored hair. And that made me wonder." Edward's voice trembled slightly. What if they didn't just kidnap Laurie, but instead changed her, manipulated her? "It sounds crazy, but this necklace left at my place. It wasn't an accident." Stephen cut in, clearly worried. "Edward, are you suggesting your daughter might be mixed up in something like this? A robbery? That's dangerous." Edward shook his head, frustration rising. "I'm not saying she's a criminal, Stephen, but if she's alive, she may have been forced into this. The police need to know." Just as he finished speaking, the office door opened and two police officers stepped in. It was the same team Edward had spotted the previous night, and their expressions were far from reassuring. Detective Ferreira, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a worn-out gaze, nodded in greeting at Edward. "Good morning, sir. We're here to gather more information about the robbery from last night." Edward turned around, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. "Detective, there's something important I need to tell you. I went to a man's house who was also robbed, and he told me he saw a girl among the robbers." Ferreira raised an eyebrow, mentally noting the detail. "A girl? That's certainly unusual. Are you sure it was a young girl? Any detail could be helpful." Edward took a deep breath, repeating the description the man had given him. He said she had a streak of light-colored hair and seemed to be giving orders. He also mentioned she didn't appear nervous, as if she was used to what she was doing. Ferreira scribbled quick notes, while another officer glanced at Edward with interest. "And you think your daughter might be involved in this?" the detective asked, looking Edward straight in the eye. Edward hesitated, the inner conflict visible on his face. "I don't want to believe that, but it's a possibility. The house was ransacked, but her necklace was there. It feels like there's some kind of connection." Ferreira's expression shifted to one of contemplation. "We'll investigate this further. If a young girl is involved, this situation may be more complicated than we anticipated. We might need a formal statement from you once we gather more information. It's important you stay in touch, and if you remember anything else, don't hesitate to reach out." Edward nodded, his heart racing. Even though there were still shadows around the light at the end of the tunnel, he was starting to see it. Once the officers left, Stephen and Raymond exchanged concerned glances. "So, Edward, what's our next move?" Raymond asked, his voice trembling with worry. "We have to get to the bottom of this. I'll do a full investigation. If Laurie's involved, I need to find her and keep her safe. I can't leave her in the hands of those people. Stephen placed a reassuring hand on Edward's shoulder, silently offering his support. "We're with you, Edward. No matter where this leads, we won't let you face it alone." Determined, the three men began putting together a plan. Edward pulled out his phone and quickly searched for similar incidents, focused on finding any clues that might lead him to Laurie. The thought of her possibly living in an unknown world, forced into something dark and sinister, burned within him like a torch. "We need to check the security cameras from the area where that guy was attacked and around your house. There might be something useful," Stephen suggested. "If the police can't act fast enough, maybe we can try on our own. We could also make a list of potential witnesses or neighbors who might have seen something." Edward nodded, feeling more encouraged. Working together made him feel that finding Laurie was still within reach. The trio started jotting down notes and building a plan of action, unaware that each step was bringing them closer to the truth and to Laurie. The next day, Edward was back at home. His mind was racing with all the details and leads he had gathered. He'd spent a sleepless night thinking about Laurie and everything he'd uncovered so far. Late in the morning, as he got ready to make a few more calls, he went to the kitchen to brew a strong cup of coffee. That's when something caught his eye at the edge of the dining table, a folded piece of paper, as if it had been left there waiting for him. Heart pounding, Edward walked over and picked up the note. Unfolding it, a wave of nervous energy surged through him as he recognized the hurried but familiar handwriting. The words were brief, but packed with urgency. "Edward, I need to speak with you. It's about Laurie. There are truths you need to know. Meet at Central Park at 1888. Don't tell anyone. It's dangerous." Edward felt his stomach twist. The hours that followed were a blend of anxiety and hope. He gazed out the window, trying to imagine who might have left the note and what truth they might hold. The possibility of learning something about Laurie left him restless, but a chill of distrust also ran down his spine. After all he had been through, how could he trust someone tied to his suffering? Edward remembered his conversation with Hector, who had also lost his daughter. Hector had told him that sometimes pain could forge unexpected bonds. Edward knew he needed more information before making any decisions. So he called Hector, still considering whether to involve him in this new revelation. "Hector, you won't believe what happened," Edward began with a tense tone. "I just got a note from someone who claims to know about Laurie. They want to meet with me tonight in the Central Park." Hector was silent for a moment, as if weighing the seriousness of the situation. "Edward, this could be a setup. You shouldn't go alone. You need someone by your side." Edward hesitated, but the thought of not learning more about his daughter was overwhelming. "I don't think I can wait any longer. If this person has answers, I need to go." Hector took a deep breath. "All right, but I'll go with you. If it's dangerous, at least we'll have each other. Promise me you won't do anything without talking to me first." "I promise," Edward replied, relieved to have his trusted friend with him. As the scheduled time drew near, his tension only grew. Deep down, Edward knew he had to go. His need to find Laurie and make sense of everything was stronger than his fear. "I just hope this person is telling the truth," he murmured, more to himself than to Hector. As night fell, Edward and Hector met at the entrance to the Central Park. Shadows cloaked the area, and the faint moonlight barely lit the path ahead. They stayed alert, scanning their surroundings for any sign of movement. Edward felt his heart pounding as he glanced around, waiting to see someone emerge from the darkness. "Remember, we have to be careful," Hector cautioned, keeping his eyes fixed on a corner of the park where trees sheltered the shadows. "No one's waiting for us, but this could be a setup. Edward nodded, his mind circling around the idea that any moment could lead them into something life-changing. They made their way to the bank mentioned in the note. As they waited, a blend of anxiety and hope filled him. After a few minutes, Edward noticed a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a man's outline, and soon he recognized it was a young guy. His heart raced as the figure cautiously approached. "Are you Edward?" The voice was calm, but there was an urgency he couldn't ignore. "I'm James. I have information about Laurie." Edward felt a chill in his stomach. "What do you know? Where is she?" he asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. "Not here. We need to leave." "It's dangerous," James said, glancing around nervously. "They could be watching. Come, follow me." Without a second thought, Edward and Raymond exchanged glances and followed James, who led them to a more secluded part of the park. Edward's heart was pounding with adrenaline, filled with both hope for answers and a keen awareness of the risks they were taking. After all, who could he truly trust? After a few minutes of walking, they reached a small, abandoned house nestled in the woods. The place was covered in vines and looked like it hadn't been occupied for years. James glanced around once more before pushing the door open with difficulty. "Get inside. Quick," he motioned. The interior was run down. The walls were peeling and a musty smell filled the air. Edward and Raymond exchanged looks, but they followed James into a dimly lit room where a faint light flickered. James turned on a flashlight to illuminate the space. "This doesn't feel safe," Raymond muttered, his skepticism evident. "It's safer than being out there where anyone could see us," James replied, running a hand through his hair, clearly uneasy. "I swear, I'm only trying to help." Edward was flooded with a whirlpool of emotions. He wanted to trust James, but the fear of setup lingered in his mind. What does he know about Laurie? He wondered. Before James could respond, a loud bang shattered the silence. A gunshot echoed through the room, and Edward watched in horror as James stumbled backward. Hit, panic surged in Edward's gaze, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he dove behind a table for cover. The sound of the shot pounded in his ears, and his heartbeat raced wildly. "No, James!" Edward shouted, his voice breaking with disbelief, as if the scene was unreal. He found himself in a place where truth and violence were inseparably tangled, and everything he thought he knew was crumbling. James lay on the ground, his face frozen in a mixture of pain and shock. Edward saw his friend fall, then noticed Claire rushing over to James's body. "What's happening?" he muttered out loud, fear tightening in his chest. He needed answers, but the chaos was overwhelming. "Edward, we have to go!" Claire shouted, grabbing his hand. He hesitated for a split second, his eyes fixed on James, but Claire's urgent tone jolted him into action. They dashed toward the exit, never looking back. The house, once a haven of secrets, had turned into a battlefield. As they burst through the door, Edward felt the chill of the night air, though the adrenaline coursing through him blocked out any other sensation. "Where are we going?" he asked, gasping for breath. "We need to hide. Let's go to the park. It's safer there," Claire replied, her determined tone firing him up. Edward nodded, and together they ran down the path toward the park. The trees cast ominous shadows in the moonlight, and the sounds of heavy footsteps and voices drawing closer created an atmosphere thick with desperation. When they reached a secluded corner in the park, Claire stopped and took a deep breath. "If we can find somewhere to hide, we'll have a moment to think about what to do next," she said, scanning the area as though mentally mapping it. "We need a plan. They know we're here, and we can't just stay put," Edward said, his heart pounding. He looked around and spotted a car parked a little way off. "I think we can take that car." "It's too risky. What if they see us?" Claire objected, her voice laced with worry. But the urgency of the situation made her rethink. If we stay here and they find us, we won't have a choice, she added, trying to steady herself. Edward insisted, guiding Claire to follow him in that direction. They moved quickly toward the car, scanning the surroundings to ensure no one was nearby. Edward opened the car door, sliding into the driver's seat and starting the engine. Claire climbed into the passenger side, her eyes wide as she scanned the area. "Come on, we need to go," Edward urged, already pressing the gas. After the tense meeting at the cafe, Edward had decided it was best to take Raymond home, where he could stay safe while they waited for more information. They exchanged serious glances, both fully aware of the gravity of their situation. Though Raymond looked worried, he seemed determined to help. "Stay here and keep safe," Edward said firmly. "I'll look for information. As soon as I know anything about Laurie, I'll let you know," he added, placing a reassuring hand on Raymond's shoulder. "Be careful, Edward. Those people are dangerous," Raymond warned, his voice thick with concern. "I know, but I can't just sit back," Edward replied, resolved. "Laurie needs me." With that, he bid Raymond goodbye and left, driving through the city streets, still reeling from everything that had happened that night. Every red light felt like an eternity, and each turn seemed to pull him further from what he truly wanted, Laurie's safety. When he finally reached his house, Edward felt the familiarity of home, though everything seemed different now. The silence was heavy, and Laurie's absence made the place feel hollow. He shut the door behind him, and as he flicked on the lights, a flood of memories washed over him. He thought back to when he adopted Laurie, a little girl just a few years old. He'd been so excited and, at the same time, so nervous about becoming a father. He remembered the first time he saw her. With her wide, bright eyes, full of curiosity and innocence, she had run up to him, grabbing his hand tightly, her smile lighting up the room. "Come on, Daddy, let's play," Laurie had exclaimed, her laughter echoing through the room as she pulled Edward toward the backyard. Edward's memories of those first days together felt vivid. He recalled how Laurie would explore every corner of the house, as though each day was a fresh adventure. That first night they shared a home, he held her close, feeling the warmth and safety in her tiny frame against him. "I promise to always protect you," he whispered as she drifted off to sleep. It was a vow he clung to, even during the roughest times. Edward made his way to the shelf where he kept the photos. With a gentle light casting across the room, he sifted through memories until he came upon a photo of Laurie from a past birthday, her smile beaming. Cake and balloons were all around her. He touched the picture fondly, his heart clenching, as he remembered how much joy Laurie had always brought into his life. "How could I have let her go?" he muttered, a tightness forming in his throat. He had always loved her, as if she were his own daughter. These thoughts led him to question the choices he'd made over the years. Although he knew that adopting her was the best thing he could have done, time had passed, and he still felt the lingering presence of her absence. Even as he tried to move forward, her absence remained a shadow in his life. He realized that, despite formally letting go, he had never stopped caring for her well-being. He knew he needed to take action. He stood up and began searching for any clues he might have missed over the years. In the bottom drawer of the coffee table, he found an old journal he had kept about his time with Laurie. He opened it, his eyes drifting over the worn pages. One particular entry about the adoption caught his attention. He recalled the joy he felt in finally building a family with her. "If you ever read this, know that I'll always be here for you, and you'll always be my little girl," he wrote, tears slipping down his face. Time slipped away as Edward revisited each precious memory of Laurie. He decided he needed to uncover what had truly happened since she was adopted, and more importantly, why she might have ended up in such a dark situation. The next morning, Edward awoke with a mix of hope and unease. The sunlight poured through the curtains, but the weight of the night's thoughts still lingered in his heart. After a sleepless night filled with thoughts of Laurie, Edward decided he needed to gather his strength and nourish himself for another day of uncertainty. He quickly dressed and headed to a small bakery he often visited for a cup of coffee. The scent of freshly baked bread and steaming coffee filled the air, wrapping him in the comforting atmosphere of the place. While he waited for his order, his gaze wandered through the customers. Suddenly, his heart began to race. At a nearby table, a young girl with wavy brown hair and bright eyes sat, her features uncannily resembling Laurie's. The likeness was so striking that Edward froze in his spot. A mixture of hope and confusion stirred within him. He moved toward the girl's table and, doing his best to keep the urgency out of his voice, said, "Excuse me, but you look a lot like someone I know." The girl looked at him with curiosity, but her expression soon shifted to one of puzzlement. "Who?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Laurie. She's my daughter, and I haven't seen her in years," Edward replied, his voice shaking with emotion. "You look so much like her." The girl offered a gentle smile but then shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir. My name is Claire. I'm not your daughter. I've never known anyone named Laurie." Her voice was soft yet firm. Edward felt an emptiness settle within him. "Of course," he muttered, forcing a smile. "I apologize if I disturbed you. You just reminded me so much of her." He turned back to his place in line, heart weighed down. While waiting for his coffee, Edward reflected on the brief encounter. He felt his hope slip away once more. What he had wanted was some sign that Laurie was alive and well. Instead, he found only an echo of his pain. Claire, though a stranger, had rekindled the ache he felt for his daughter. As he stepped out of the bakery, Edward took a deep breath, gathering his strength. The photo, even if it wasn't of Laurie, had reopened some deep wounds. Edward was aware that he needed to remain focused on his search and not allow passing hopes to divert him. Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered immediately, recognizing Raymond's number. "Edward, we need to meet. We found something about the van involved in the break-in." Raymond's voice was urgent. "I'm on my way," Edward replied firmly. The cafe meeting hadn't provided the answers he was hoping for, but he knew the investigation was far from over. He couldn't afford to let his guard down now. As he got into his car, Edward recalled Raymond's words and promised himself he wouldn't stray from his mission. Each step brought him closer to the truth, and no matter how painful it might be, he was determined to uncover what had happened to Laurie. He drove quickly to the agreed meeting point, his heart racing in anticipation. He needed answers, and any lead about the van could be the start of a more concrete path toward finding Laurie. When he arrived at the modest cafe, he spotted Raymond already seated in the back, watching the door intently. As soon as Edward walked in, Raymond waved him over, signaling to the chair across from him. "I managed to get some information, but you'll need to listen closely," Raymond began, his voice low and tense, as he slid a wrinkled envelope across the table. Edward took it, opening it with shaky hands to reveal grainy photos of a dark van with visible damage along the side. "This van was spotted on the night of the break-in at your place. A neighbor noticed something unusual and managed to snap these pictures. It was a lucky shot, but it supports what the police have suspected." Edward studied the photos carefully, his eyes absorbing every detail. "Is there a visible license plate?" he asked, hope clear in his voice. Raymond shook his head. The plate was either removed or covered. But there's more. A police informant told me this van was also seen at other recent break-ins around the city. And it's not just that. Raymond paused, locking eyes with Edward. They're saying that at least 2 of those break-ins involved a young woman, matching the description given by the neighbor, seen getting in and out of the van. Edward felt the air leave his lungs. A young woman. Could it be Laurie? The words came out slowly, each one feeling like a hard-won battle. Raymond hesitated briefly before answering. I'm not sure, Edward. This could just be a coincidence, but after the necklace, and now this new clue, we can't ignore it. We have to see where this leads, Edward replied, rubbing his hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble and the tension pounding in his temples. If this is real, if she's involved in some way, I need to understand why. What's happened to my daughter all these years? That's what we're going to find out, said Raymond, resting a hand on Edward's shoulder in a gesture of support. But we need to tread carefully. If she's involved, it might not be by her own choice. Edward nodded, absorbing the thought. Each new detail made his heart swing between despair and hope. He wasn't sure if the young woman the neighbors had seen was truly Laurie, but the possibility strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't rest until he found answers, no matter how difficult they might be. Edward stayed still for a few moments, hidden in the shadows cast by the abandoned buildings. His mind raced, battling the urge to rush to the warehouse entrance and confront the men and the young woman he believed could be Laurie. But reason took over, and he decided that caution was his best ally for now. He needed to be certain of what was happening before making a move. Just then, he heard the sound of an engine. He quickly turned and saw the black van, the same one from the photos, pulling out from an alley near the warehouse. It moved slowly, headlights piercing through the darkness of the empty street. Edward felt his pulse quicken. This was his chance to follow the lead. Moving swiftly and quietly, he got back to his car, parked at a safe distance. The van had already gained some ground, but Edward managed to maneuver his vehicle and follow it, keeping a safe distance to avoid drawing attention. The quiet, pre-dawn streets made the pursuit easier, but also meant his every move could stand out. The van turned left onto a narrow road, passing by deserted warehouses and factories, looking like they were haunted by the night's shadows. Edward kept pace, driving with his lights off to stay unnoticed. His mind was torn between the anxiety of uncovering the truth and the fear of what he might find. At every corner they turned, he envisioned a different outcome. The van could be heading to another hideout, a meeting point, or maybe even a house where his daughter was being held. Whatever lay ahead, he had to be ready to act. After about 20 minutes of following, the van moved into a busier part of the city, where a few late-night stores still had their lights on. Edward had to be more cautious, slowing down and blending in with the sparse traffic. He watched as the van pulled into a poorly lit alley near an old warehouse with a faded exterior. Edward parked his car a short distance away, keeping an eye on the alley. He saw one of the men, familiar from the warehouse shadows, step out of the driver's door and scan the area, checking to see if he was being followed. Edward held his breath, crouching slightly in his seat, praying the man would notice him. After a few moments, the van's back door opened, and he saw the young girl step out. She wore a dark coat and kept her head down, but even in the dim light, he recognized her familiar posture. His hands started to tremble at the thought that he was finally one step closer to reuniting with his daughter. The young girl exchanged a few quick words with the driver before entering the warehouse. Edward watched closely, etching every detail into his mind. He knew he needed to move closer to hear more, but every instinct in him warned him to stay cautious. The danger he might face there was real, yet the urge to find Laurie pushed him forward. Heart pounding, Edward slipped out of his car and ducked behind a stack of boxes near the alley. The van remained parked, and the driver was now leaning against the door, smoking a cigarette. Edward stayed still, waiting for an opening. Inside the warehouse, muffled voices could be heard, but he couldn't make out the words. He was close, yet still far from the truth. Edward stayed completely still for a moment, hidden in the shadows cast by the abandoned buildings. His mind was racing, fighting the urge to rush toward the warehouse entrance and confront the men and the young woman he believed to be Laurie. But his sense of caution won out, reminding him that patience was his strongest ally right now. He needed to be sure of what was happening before making a move. Edward held his ground, his breathing shallow, as he watched the activity within the warehouse. The door creaked open again, and the same young woman from before reappeared. This time, she stepped into the dim light cast by a street lamp in the alley, giving Edward a clearer view of her face. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes confirmed what his heart had already feared. It was Laurie. She looked older, with mature features carrying traces of a past he didn't know. The same brown curls he used to brush away when he read her bedtime stories now bounced as she moved with a kind of determination that both frightened and intrigued him. Edward wanted to rush to her to call out her name, but something held him back. An instinct warned him it wasn't the right time. "Hurry up!" An impatient voice echoed from inside the warehouse. A tall man with a scar slicing across his left eyebrow appeared, clutching a gun. He looked at Laurie with annoyance, then turned toward the group that emerged behind her. "The boss said we need to pick up the pace. We've got a new house to hit, and there's no time to waste." A chill ran down Edward's spine. The boss, another hit. His mind raced through the possibilities, trying to piece together the puzzle unfolding before him. Was Laurie involved in this willingly, or was she just a pawn in a much larger and more dangerous game? Edward crouched lower behind the stack of crates. Every muscle in his body was tense as the group began moving out of the warehouse. Laurie hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the darkness, as if sensing that something was out of place. Edward held his breath, the urge to call out to her nearly overpowering his reason. "Let's go, Laurie," the man with the scar barked impatiently, banging the metal door with the butt of his gun. She cast one last glance down the alley before following the group, vanishing into the van with the other armed men. Edward stood frozen, watching as the vehicle slowly rolled out of the alley and faded into the night's darkness. When the engine's hum finally faded, Edward let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. His heart still pounded, a wave of fear washing over him. Seeing Laurie there, alive yet seemingly entangled in something so dangerous, shocked him to his core. She was in serious trouble, and he knew he had to act quickly, but without putting himself in harm's way. As he tried to piece everything together, the echo of gunshots he'd heard inside the warehouse still lingered in his mind. He didn't know who had fired or why, but the urgency to get out of there and plan his next move was undeniable. Edward stumbled back to his car, his legs shaking and his mind racing. He knew the night ahead could be the most pivotal of his life. With barely a moment to catch his breath, he climbed into his car, adrenaline coursing through his veins, and started the engine quietly. The black van was already pulling away, its taillights flickering in the pre-dawn darkness. He waited a few seconds to avoid drawing attention before trailing behind at a safe distance, keeping his own lights off and making sure not to make any sudden moves. The city streets were empty, each sound echoing louder in the stillness of the night. Edward stayed focused, taking deep breaths to steady his nerves. He understood the risk he was taking, but the image of Laurie, so close, yet so changed from the girl he once knew, fueled his resolve. The van turned right onto a wider avenue, then entered a neighborhood lined with large houses, pristine gardens, and iron gates. He recognized the area immediately. It was a place where other wealthy businessmen and high-profile figures lived. His heart pounded harder as he watched the van finally stop in front of one of the grand mansions. The location belonged to a well-known businessman in the city, someone Edward had already encountered at high-end events and business gatherings. He parked the car at a safe distance, hidden in the shadow of a large tree. He watched as the men climbed out of the van, including the scarred guy, and to his shock and dismay, Laurie. She moved swiftly, seeming to be in charge as she directed the others and gave quick, clear orders. Edward wrestled with the emotions surging through him. How did she end up here? Why was she leading a group of criminals? Questions crowded his mind, but he knew he needed to stay focused, observing and understanding what was about to unfold. One of the men approached the mansion's gate, expertly working the lock in a way that showed his skill. Edward seized the moment of distraction to slip quietly out of his car and hide behind a low wall, closer to the house. The tension was thick, and he held his breath as he heard the faint click of the gate unlocking. "Let's move quickly. The security system will be disabled for only a short time," said the scarred man, signaling to the others. Laurie stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the entrance to the house. Edward noted her expression was cold and calculating, but for a fleeting moment he glimpsed something familiar. Was it doubt? Regret? As they all passed through the gate and advanced toward the house, Edward knew he had to act soon. He couldn't take them on alone, but he needed a plan. With his heart pounding, he pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to his contact. "I've found Laurie. Invasion in progress. Need backup." From a distance, Edward watched the team spread out across the mansion's grounds, preparing for entry. They were clearly well-trained, moving with a precision that made it obvious this wasn't their first operation of this kind. Laurie directed them with sharp, concise gestures, and Edward felt a mix of pride and sadness. Pride in seeing her so strong and capable, sadness knowing it was pulling her into a dark path. Inside the mansion, the lights were off, with only the soft reflection of the moon casting shadows in the windows. Edward knew the homeowner was away, likely a detail meticulously planned by the group. The risk was massive, yet Edward watched as one of the men used a tool to pry open one of the side doors of the house, while 3 others kept a lookout. Edward stood frozen, cold sweat trickling down his forehead, his mind racing at 1,000 miles per hour. He had to figure out a way to step in without risking Laurie's life. But the harsh reality was that he was alone and at a serious disadvantage. One wrong move could ruin everything. Suddenly, a loud noise shattered the night's silence. An alarm blared from the neighboring house, likely due to a timing error by the intruders. The men exchanged nervous glances, and Laurie quickly moved closer to the man with the scar, saying something Edward couldn't make out, but he saw the frustration on the man's face. Even in the dark, the glint in her eyes revealed her resolve. This was his daughter, the girl he had raised with so much love, yet now she was caught up in something he couldn't understand. Before he could process it further, the wail of a distant siren echoed, and the intruders sprang into motion. "Let's get out of here now," barked the scarred man, yanking Laurie by the arm, while the others retreated to their truck. Edward watched as they quickly disappeared, leaving behind a mansion that appeared to have been the victim of an attempted break-in with a sinking heart. He knew this was his chance to trail the truck and figure out where they were heading. Moving swiftly, he got back in his car and, wasting no time, started the engine, keeping a safe distance from the truck as it sped down certain city streets. The adrenaline still pumped through his veins, but now it mingled with a newfound determination. He was closer to uncovering the truth of what had led Laurie into such a dangerous world. The truck turned down a street leading to a more rundown part of the city, where old warehouses and abandoned buildings were a common sight. Edward stayed alert, certain that this next step would be critical to solving the mystery and perhaps finding a way to save his daughter from the dangerous path she was on. More than ever, he knew he was venturing into unknown territory. But one thing was clear. He wouldn't give up on Laurie, even if it meant facing hell on his own. Before Edward could get closer and attempt to follow the truck further, the sound of police sirens grew louder. The street flooded with flashes of red and blue lights, and the adrenaline in his body quickly morphed into panic. He looked around, trying to figure out how he could slip away without drawing attention. But it was too late. One of the patrol cars came to a screeching halt right beside him, and two officers jumped out, guns drawn. "Hands up, don't move," commanded one of the officers, his tone leaving no room for disobedience. Edward froze, lifting his hands compliantly. His heart pounded wildly, his breathing heavy and shallow. Meanwhile, the group in the van seized the moment and began to slip away into the darkness, weaving through the narrow streets of the city. Edward tried to keep his eyes on them, but he was soon forced down onto his knees. "Identify yourself," the other officer demanded, as he began to search him. Edward fought to keep his composure, but the urge to explain was nearly overwhelming. "I'm Edward Fernandez, a businessman," he said urgently. "My daughter, she was taken years ago. The van just now, they're involved somehow." The officers exchanged a wary look, clearly skeptical. "Sir, you were found at the scene of an attempted robbery. Until we can sort things out, we'll have to bring you to the station for further questioning," stated the first officer, as the other one locked handcuffs onto his wrists. Edward felt frustration ignite within him. Everything he'd been fighting for, all his hopes of finding Laurie, seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He knew every second counted, and getting detained now meant losing precious time that could have been used to follow her. "Please, you don't understand," he pleaded, as they led him toward the squad car. "I just saw my daughter. She's in danger. But it's not what you think. I need to help her." His words seemed to have no effect on the officers, who seated him firmly in the back of the car and shut the door with a metallic click. Edward looked out the window, watching the flash of the sirens illuminate the street, casting shadows across the houses. The van carrying Laurie had already vanished into the night, leaving him with a crushing sense of despair. Sitting in the back of the police car, he desperately tried to think of a way out of this situation. Memories of Laurie, the young girl he had adopted and loved as if she were his own daughter, flooded his mind. He remembered the first time he saw her at an orphanage, her wide, curious eyes, and the way she immediately smiled at him. Their bond had been instant, and he had vowed to do everything in his power to protect her. Now, that promise felt distant and shattered. Edward was led into a chilly interrogation space with a flickering fluorescent light overhead. The clock on the wall ticked at a painfully slow pace, each second pounding against his resolve. Edward was pushed into the room with a bit more force than necessary. The officer, a stern-looking man with tired lines etched into his face, followed him in, shutting the door with a loud thud that echoed through the room. "Mr. Fernandez, I need you to explain what you were doing at a crime scene," the officer demanded, arms crossed, his gaze filled with distrust and impatience. "I already told you, Chatun, sir." Edward burst out, his voice cutting through the silence. "I was following that van because my daughter was in it. She disappeared 8 years ago, and today I finally saw her. You have to let me go. I need to find her before it's too late." The officer's expression didn't change, his face remaining impassive as Edward struggled to steady his shaking hands. "Mr. Fernandez, I know your story is well known around town, but that doesn't excuse the fact that you were found under suspicious circumstances near an attempted break-in. I need solid evidence, and until then, you're just a civilian who put himself in danger." Edward felt his blood boil, frustration pouring over as he stepped forward, challenging the officer's authority. "Evidence? I saw her with my own eyes, and here you are sitting behind desks while the real criminals get away, taking my daughter with them." "I don't have time for bureaucracy." The officer's brow furrowed, irritation finally breaking through his calm exterior. "Watch your tone, Mr. Fernandez. You're not the one with the upper hand here." "Is this a joke to you?" Edward shouted, his words sharp and piercing. "My daughter is out there, and you're wasting time questioning me instead of sending a team after that van. You're supposed to protect people, yet all you're doing is stopping those who actually care from taking action." The officer took a step forward, now standing face to face with Edward, the tension between them thickening the air in the room. "You're crossing the line, Fernandez, and I won't stand for it." Edward didn't back down. "Do whatever you want, but know that every second you hold me here, Laurie slips further out of reach." Without another word, the officer signaled to the two officers waiting by the door. "Take him to a cell. Let him cool off for a while." Before Edward could protest, they seized him by the arms and led him out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the precinct's hallway like a fading hope. Anger and helplessness twisted in his chest, driving him to instinctively resist, but his struggle only tightened the officer's grip on him. Edward knew any attempt to break free was pointless, but his body acted on its own, propelled by the desperation of someone who was just a step away from saving the most important person in his life. The officers pushed him into a cold, bare cell, its concrete walls breathing an air of damp neglect. The sound of the iron door slamming shut reverberated through the space, like a final blow sealing his fate, a sound mocking his predicament. The weight of the world settled on Edward's shoulders as he found himself locked up, a prisoner of his own decisions. He sank onto the hard bench, the worn wood creaking beneath him. Each breath felt labored, as if every inhale burned in his lungs, and his heart pounded wildly, hammering against his chest like a relentless drumbeat. The tension in his body was unbearable. His muscles strained as though they might snap, and the veins in his arms throbbed with restrained fury. Edward tried to take a deep breath, but his screams of frustration stayed trapped in his throat, choking him all the more. He wanted to yell, to pound on the walls until his fists bled, to do something to release the stinging ache of being helpless, locked away, while Laurie, his long-lost, now-found daughter, was out there in danger. His eyes scanned the small cell, where shadows flickered beneath the dim hallway light. There was nothing there that could help him, no escape, no hope. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his muscles quivering under the strain. He felt trapped, helpless, like a caged animal, while time, that relentless enemy, kept moving forward. Every second spent in that cell was like a blow to his resolve, a ruthless countdown widening the gap between him and Laurie. "Damn it!" he shouted, finally letting a sliver of his anguish slip out. His voice echoed in the empty cell, bouncing back at him in mocking defiance. Edward abruptly stood up, pacing back and forth, his footsteps pounding against the concrete floor. The thought that he had failed to protect her, that he might be missing his only chance to save her, gnawed at his spirit like acid. Memories of a younger Laurie flooded his mind. He saw her again, her hair flowing in the breeze as she laughed, running across the garden at home. That laugh, so pure and innocent, now seemed like a distant sound, nearly forgotten. Edward tried to hold on to the memory before it faded, but when he closed his eyes, Laurie from the previous night took its place, cold, distant, leading a dangerous mission. The hours dragged on, and dawn began to approach, cloaking the station in a blanket of silence. Edward sat down on the concrete bench, his thoughts swirling like a storm. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, and the hope that Laurie was safe seemed to dim with every breath. The loneliness of that cell weighed heavily, and he wondered if, by morning, he'd still have any chance of finding her. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Edward tensed, his senses sharpening. He was about to yell for help when the door opened with a faint creak. In the dim light, he recognized the figure of Stephen, his loyal friend and assistant, coming to free him from this makeshift prison. "Edward," Stephen whispered, casting a nervous glance around before stepping into the cell. "Come on, quickly." Edward could hardly believe his eyes. "How did you get the key?" he asked, disbelief clear in his voice. Stephen smiled, his eyes flashing with a hint of mischief. "I bribed the guard. I gave him my entire paycheck. And you know it's not much, especially since you haven't given me a raise," he said, pausing with a dramatic lift of his eyebrows. "Guess you'll have to pay me again. Right?" Edward couldn't help but laugh, even amid the tension. "You can't be serious. You gave up everything you had to get me out of here. Look, I just wanted to do the right thing. Besides, if you stay here, who's going to run your businesses? And who's going to help find your daughter?" Stephen replied, his face serious. "And you know I'm not the best at managing things on my own. You're really crazy. But I'm grateful." "Let's get out of here before someone notices," Edward said, his heart racing with the possibility of freedom. He stood up, following Stephen down the police station hallway, which now felt like a maze of doors and shadows. The two moved silently, with Stephen leading the way. Every step echoed in their chests, and Edward stayed alert for any sound that might mean someone was awake. Adrenaline surged through him as they approached the exit. Finally, they reached the door, and Stephen hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was nearby. "Let's go," he murmured, carefully opening the door. Edward felt the cool morning breeze as they stepped outside, a mix of relief and the weight of what still lay ahead. "Where's the car?" he asked, his mind already focused on finding Laurie. "A few blocks from here. I had to be quick and keep it out of sight. If anyone realizes I'm gone, I could be in trouble too," Stephen explained, keeping his voice low. They moved cautiously through the empty streets and the silent city surrounding them. The moon cast a silver glow over the houses, creating long shadows that stretched toward them. Edward's mind raced with thoughts, but part of him was glad Stephen was there. His friend had always been a steady presence in tough times. "You really took a risk for me, Stephen," Edward said, looking at him with gratitude. "I just hope it wasn't in vain." "Hey, I'd do it again if I had to," Stephen replied. "What are we if not friends?" Stephen added, giving him a light tap on the shoulder. "And besides, I already told you, you're going to have to pay me back that salary, so you're not off the hook just yet." Edward chuckled, appreciating Stephen's humor amidst all the tension. "If that's not a reason to hurry up, I don't know what is." As soon as they reached Stephen's car, Edward slid into the passenger seat, watching the city move around them. Stephen started the engine and maneuvered to leave. Edward took a deep breath, looking at the sky, trying to steady himself. "So, what now?" Stephen asked, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Edward hesitated, weighing his options. "We need to find that van. If it's still around, we can figure out where they took Laurie." Stephen nodded, a sense of resolve building between them. "And how do you plan on doing that?" "The street downtown. I'll remember the route. Let's head back there and see if we can pick up any clues." The hope that was still present in Edward's heart gave his voice an urgency. As the car sped through the dark streets, Edward allowed himself a moment to dream. If he found Laurie, maybe all of this would have been worth it. The bond between father and daughter was stronger than any prison, and he was determined to free not only himself, but his daughter as well. Stephen and Edward raced through the city streets, the car's engine roaring as they neared the warehouse. Edward's heart raced too, a mix of anxiety and resolve pulsing through his veins. He knew Laurie was in danger, and every second mattered. "This place doesn't feel right, Edward." "Are you sure this is it?" Stephen asked nervously, glancing out the window. Edward nodded, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "This is it. The warehouse is a front for all sorts of illegal activities. If they're here, this is where Laurie could be." When they arrived, a sense of urgency gripped him. The warehouse looked deserted at first glance, but a few dim lights flickered at the back, signaling that something was happening. Edward felt his adrenaline spike as they got out of the car and slipped inside the building. The inside was packed with stacked boxes and equipment. They moved cautiously, trying to make no noise. Edward could hear voices coming from a room further down, and his instincts led him to a door that was slightly ajar. "Let's listen," Edward whispered, pressing his ear against the door. What happened next made his heart race. Raymond said, "We need to be ready." "He doesn't want any more trouble with Edward," a deep voice said. The mention of Raymond made Edward's stomach churn. "Is Raymond here?" he murmured, growing more worried. "Yes, and he already knows Edward is getting close. We need to move fast," another man replied. "The last thing we want is for him to interfere." Edward exchanged a tense glance with Stephen. What was Raymond doing there? How had he gotten involved in all of this? "Will I find out?" Edward said, determined to learn more. They snuck through the warehouse, getting closer to the room where the voices were coming from. Once they were near enough, Edward peeked through the crack in the door. Armed men were now surrounding the man who had once been his employee, friend, and confidant. He spoke with confidence Edward had never seen before. "Edward is no longer a threat. He's already locked up. Now, we need to focus on getting what we want," Raymond said, a cruel smile curling his lips. The revelation hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. Raymond, the friend he had always thought he could trust, was now the leader of the criminal gang behind the kidnapping of his daughter. How could he do this? Edward thought, the betrayal cutting deep. Stephen also overheard the conversation. His eyes widened in disbelief. "It can't be." "Hector," Edward whispered in disbelief. He felt paralyzed by the betrayal. The man he had once trusted as a friend was behind all this pain. He knew he had to act, but how could he possibly stand up to someone who now seemed so powerful? Rage swelled within him like a volcano about to explode. "Hector! Traitor! How could you do this?" Edward shouted, his voice echoing through the empty warehouse. He strained against the ropes that bound him, his body tense and determined. "You used me. You used my daughter." Hector smirked, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You were never a threat, Edward. You were always just a pawn in my game. You just didn't realize it until now." Outrage flooded Edward. He twisted against the ropes holding him. The adrenaline coursed through his veins. He wanted to stand up and face Hector once and for all, but the ropes kept him bound. "You'll pay for this. You can't keep going like this." Hector took a step closer, an arrogant smile on his face. "Edward, your pain has blinded you so that you are unable to see that there is no way out of this. Look at your daughter. She's a part of this now." Laurie, who had remained silent, watched the scene with wide, fearful eyes. Edward felt the urge to protect his daughter grow stronger than ever. He couldn't let her be dragged into this dark world. At that moment, Edward twisted again, muscles straining in a frantic effort to break free. "Hector, you can't do this. I'll stop you." He turned to Laurie. His voice was filled with desperation. "Daughter, stay away from them." Hector laughed cruelly. His oppressive presence filled the space. You really think she'll escape? Her life is tied to mine now. How about you? Will you just be a memory? Hector said, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. Edward felt an overwhelming urge to go to Laurie. He needed to hold her and protect her at any cost. Laurie, I'm here, don't worry. But the men holding his arms stopped him from moving. Frustrated, he shouted, trying to rise from his chair. Shut up, Hector commanded, his voice dripping with contempt. I'll make sure you never see your daughter again. The tension in the air was thick. Edward realized he had to act. With a primal scream, he lunged forward, as though the ropes binding him were non-existent. He sprang from his chair, eyes blazing with fury, and charged at Hector. The group around him froze in shock. Even bound, Edward was determined. He struck Hector, and the fight quickly escalated. The men tried to hold him back, but the surge of adrenaline pushed him to fight harder than ever before. You won't take my daughter, he shouted, his body moving with relentless determination. He knew he couldn't afford to fail. Hector tried to fight back, but Edward was resolute in refusing to let him take control. The two grappled as the others struggled to contain them. Finally, Edward landed a punch on Hector, sending him stumbling back. Laurie, watching with her heart in her throat, remained silent, her face a mixture of fear and hope. Edward moved quickly because he needed to protect his daughter. Edward, stay calm. Let's get out of here, Stephen screamed, trying to help. As the fight continued to intensify, he struggled to break free from his restraints, but the ropes were tightly secured. The room was filled with shouting and the sound of furniture crashing to the floor. Edward was focused on reaching Laurie. The battle in his heart pushed through the pain and fear. He was determined to get her out of this nightmare. I'm here, sweetheart. Don't worry, Hector shouted, glaring at Laurie with intensity. Furious, he stood up and, his face, twisted in vengeance, lunged toward Edward once more. You think you can win this fight? You're finished. But Edward wasn't finished. He was fighting for his daughter, for his life. With a final surge of strength, he charged at Hector, determined to protect Laurie and himself, no matter the cost. Hector rose, still panting from the fight, and looked at Edward with an expression that blended rage with something far more emotional. He seemed to recover quickly. The fury that once dominated him shifted, revealing something Edward could never have expected. Stepping forward, Hector's eyes shimmered with a mix of pain and resolve. She was taken from me when she was just a little girl. I searched for her for years but couldn't find her, and when I found out you adopted her, the truth became clear. I didn't steal her, Edward. I only took back what was mine. Edward felt as if the ground had vanished beneath him. Confusion and pain collided in his mind. He remembered the day he adopted Laurie, the joy she brought into his life, but now that joy was tainted by a dark past he had never known. You can't do that. You had no right to take her. She's my daughter now. She's always been mine. Hector's voice echoed in the barn as he screamed. You don't understand what happened. I lost everything, and when I finally got a lead on her, I was already too late. I never wanted to hurt you, Edward, but I can't let you keep her. Her destiny is with me. Laurie, who had remained silent up until that point, finally spoke. Dad, please. No. She stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears as she looked between Edward and Hector. I don't understand what's going on. What are you saying, Hector? I don't belong to anyone. I am myself. Hector paused for a moment, and that gave Edward a fresh surge of hope. Laurie, you don't have to stay with him. You have a father who loves you, and I'm here to protect you. He turned to Hector, a mix of fury and resolve in his eyes. You can't just show up and claim what's not yours. She's my life now. Hector glanced at Laurie, his expression shifting. There was clear confusion, an internal battle between his desires and the reality of the situation. "I don't want you caught in this fight," he said softly. "I just want you to know the truth," he murmured. But Edward wasn't ready to accept his words. "If you really love her, then let her go. Let her live the life we chose together. She's not some trophy for you," Edward shouted, his voice filled with emotion. The tension in the air was nearly unbearable as the three of them stood, locked in an intense stare-down, each one fighting for their own version of the truth. Hector took a step back, his gaze now fixed on Edward. "You don't understand what it's like to lose a daughter. I'm not just a man trying to get back what I lost. I'm a desperate father." Laurie looked between the two men, her heart torn. "Dad, why didn't you tell me this before? Why wasn't this part of my life?" With tears streaming down her face, she appeared lost and overtaken by the intensity of her emotions. Edward felt a sharp pain seeing the confusion in Laurie's eyes. He never wanted her to feel forced to choose between them. "Laurie, please don't worry about this. We'll figure it out. You're free to decide your own future," he said, trying to reassure her. But Hector, on the other hand, was resolute. "She's not free, Edward. She's the only part of me that still exists, and I won't let you destroy her or tear her away from me again." The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Edward knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let Hector manipulate Laurie like this, forcing her to pick a side. "If Hector, you won't do this, then you can't control her choices," Edward declared. Laurie looked confused and frightened, but the tension between them was palpable. Edward moved toward her, his intentions clear. "Laurie, come with me. We need to get out of here." But Hector blocked his path, a fierce look on his face. "If you try to take her, I won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to stop you." Edward stepped closer, determined to protect Laurie. "She's my daughter, and I will fight for her, no matter what happens. You won't get what you want without a fight." The conviction in his voice echoed in the barn, each word a declaration of war. He was ready for anything, feeling the surge of adrenaline through his veins. His desire to protect Laurie was stronger than any fear he could feel. Hector glanced at Laurie, pain evident on his face. "Laurie, please understand. I only want what's best for you." There was a vulnerability in his posture, as if the revelation of her being his daughter was tearing him apart. Edward could see that Hector was wrestling with his own emotions, but that didn't make his actions any more acceptable. He couldn't allow the past to drag him back to a place of pain and suffering. "I won't let this happen," Laurie shouted, her voice filled with emotion. "I just want you to stop fighting." Fury and confusion swirled in her eyes. She looked lost, which only made everything more heartbreaking for Edward. He wanted to calm her, to explain that this fight wasn't about them, but about the love he had for her. Laurie's words resonated through the room like a cry for help, cutting through the tension in the air. She was innocent, caught in the storm, a girl who only wanted peace. Edward thought of all the happy moments they'd shared, how she had filled his life with joy and light. Now to see her torn between two men who loved her in such different ways. It shattered his heart. Hector took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Laurie, I just want to protect you. You don't know what they're capable of. You don't know how hard I fought to find you." His voice trembled, but there was a growing determination, a need to make Laurie understand his point. "I'm your father, and I won't let them hurt you again." Edward could hardly bear to hear those words. "You're not her only father," he shouted, anger burning in his chest. "She has a father who loves her and has been there for her all these years. You have no right to just show up and try to take back what isn't yours." The room felt charged, as though it were moments away from exploding. The truth unfurled like a storm, threatening to consume everyone in its path. Emotions ran high, and the battle for Laurie's heart was only just beginning. Edward knew he had to act quickly before things spiraled any further. He locked eyes with Laurie, trying to communicate the depth of his feelings. "Laurie, you are my life. I will never give up on you. Never." She hesitated. Her gaze flickered between the two men. "But I don't want to choose, Dad." Her voice trembled with distress, a reflection of the inner turmoil that gripped her. Edward watched as tears began to fall down Laurie's face, a pain so sharp it tore at his heart. He longed to comfort her, to make everything easier. But the harsh reality was that he was trapped in a situation with no clear escape. Hector, sensing the vulnerability of the moment, shifted his approach. "Laurie, please think about everything. I'm not your enemy. I'm your father too, and all I want is what's best for you." The sincerity in his voice made Edward falter for a moment. It was a convincing argument, but he knew he couldn't let Hector manipulate her emotions. "But you didn't search for me," Laurie replied, her voice strong despite the tears. "You left me, and I can't just forget all of that." Hector closed his eyes briefly, the pain of the past evident in his expression. "I had no choice, Laurie. Life tore us apart. But now that I've found you, I can't let you go again. I'm the only family you have." The words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. Not only was he fighting against Hector, but now he had to battle against the truth in those words. He recalled every moment he had spent with Laurie, feeling the weight of the struggle grow heavier. The laughter, the hugs, the unconditional love they had built together. That could never be erased. "I am your family," Edward shouted, frustration overflowing. "I've been here all these years. You can't just take her because you think you have the right to." Laurie turned to face Edward, her eyes filled with conflict. "Dad, I just want to understand. I don't know what to think." The confusion in her voice mirrored the emotional whirlwind she was going through. It was as if the two men who loved her were pulling her in opposite directions. And Edward didn't want her to feel like this. "Is this what you want?" Hector asked, his voice growing sharp again. "For her to live with a man who isn't her father? A man who doesn't know what it's like to lose a daughter?" Edward took a deep breath, knowing he needed to stay calm. "What do you want, Hector? For Laurie to live in fear? For her to never know the truth about who she really is? You can't use the past to justify your actions in the present." The tension in the room was unbearable, and it felt like everything was on the brink of collapse. In a burst of emotion, Laurie shouted, "Stop! I just want you to stop fighting over me." And in that moment, the truth wasn't just about paternity. It was about the battle for the heart and happiness of a little girl who just wanted peace. The fight was far from over, and everyone's future hung in the balance. As Edward and Hector locked eyes, a deep silence settled in the room. The unsaid words weighed heavier than any shout. Emotions were raw, and everyone knew that Laurie's choice could change everything. With tears in her eyes, Laurie looked from one to the other. The pain was clear on her face. "I missed you so much, Dad," her voice trembling. "You were always the light in my life. You always made me laugh. You made me feel loved." Edward's heart tightened, hearing those words. He wanted to hug her, tell her that he was there, that he would never leave her again. But then Laurie spoke again, her voice growing firmer. "But Raymond is my real father. He had always been there for me, even when I didn't realize it." Edward was frozen in place. The weight of Laurie's words hit him like a heavy stone. He turned toward Raymond, his anger growing. "Raymond, you, a criminal. You've turned her into one too. You're using our daughter as a pawn in your game," he continued, his outrage spilling over, and the tension in the room thickened. Edward could feel the situation about to boil over. Raymond smirked arrogantly, his eyes cold. "You have no idea what it means to be a father, Edward. I fought for her, and I did what I had to do. And you?" Edward spat, his voice shaking with fury. "You just stood by, waiting like a shadow in her life." He was beside himself with rage, moving closer to Raymond. The urge to protect Laurie overtook any sense of caution. "I'll make you pay for everything you've done." In that instant, the others in the room swiftly positioned themselves, aiming their weapons at Edward. "Calm down, Edward," one of them shouted. "You don't want to do this." But Edward's anger wouldn't let him step back. He kept moving toward Raymond, fists clenched tight. "You won't take my daughter from me, not ever again." His voice was heavy with emotion, but deep down, he knew things were about to get much worse. "You don't understand, Edward," Raymond said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'm the only one who can protect Laurie, and you're a threat to her. And to all of us." He pulled out a gun, and the room fell silent. The air was thick with tension. Laurie's eyes widen in fear, and she screams, "No, please, no, Dad, don't do it." But before anyone could react, Raymond fired. The shot echoed through the warehouse, and Laurie's heart seemed to stop. Edward, stunned, looked down at the sharp pain in his side. He couldn't believe what had just happened. A wave of betrayal and despair washed over him as he braced himself against a table. As he collapsed to the side, life slipping slowly from his grasp, Laurie screamed, rushing toward him with outstretched hands, but Raymond held her back. "No, Laurie, get out of here," Edward managed to say in a faint voice. He didn't want her to witness this. He didn't want her to carry this image with her for the rest of her life. The tension in the room reached its peak as the group seemed paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. Raymond's loyalty was being tested, but what they had just witnessed was a crime he couldn't ignore. The air was thick with terror and uncertainty. You will pay for this," Edward whispered, his eyes locked onto Raymond's, a mix of fury and anguish in his gaze. He couldn't let his story end like this. The fight for Laurie wasn't over. Even in pain, a father's resolve was unstoppable. And though everything seemed lost, he would not give up on his fight for his daughter. In a moment of despair, Laurie looked at Raymond, confused and hurt. "How could you do this? You're not the father I thought you were." Her voice quivered, but there was a strength in it that hadn't been there before. She was no longer a frightened girl, but a daughter searching for the truth. Raymond hesitated, his gaze meeting Laurie's, revealing a brief flicker of doubt. But quickly, fury took over him once again, and he shouted, "I did it for you, so you would never have to go through what I did." As Laurie struggled to understand, Edward fought against the pain, determined to stay conscious. He needed to be there for Laurie. He needed to fight so that she would know the truth about who her father really was. The battle was far from over, and the future still uncertain. But Edward would not give up. He could not let darkness take over Laurie's life. Amid the chaos, the sound of a gunshot and Laurie's scream filled the room, signaling that the real fight for her heart had just begun. And the decision Laurie made now would not only change her future, but the fate of everyone involved. As the tension in the room reached a breaking point, a distant sound began to draw nearer, growing louder. It was the sirens, cutting through the night's darkness and bringing a new element to the scene. The police had surrounded the warehouse. Their vehicles were parked in a circle, flashing red and blue lights that cut through the night, casting an eerie glow. The already charged atmosphere of tension and conflict turned almost unbearable as officers prepared to storm the building. Realizing time was running out, Hector began shouting orders to his accomplices. "Quickly, we need to get out of here." But the increased commotion from the police outside only deepened their uncertainty. Even in his weakened state, Edward felt a surge of hope wash over him. Help was on its way, and the struggle to protect Laurie was about to reach its turning point. "Dad!" Laurie cried, her eyes bouncing back and forth between Hector and Edward, distress etched across her face. "No, we can't let him get away." She was torn, caught between the overwhelming urge to stay by Hector's side and her deep desire to be with Edward. But before any decision could be made, the warehouse doors slammed open, and a group of armed officers rushed in. "Police! Everyone down!" one shouted, his voice booming with authority. The command froze everyone in their tracks. Hector, desperate, tried to make a move, but the officers quickly closed in on him. "You're under arrest. Hands on your head," one of them announced. A tense silence fell over the room as the officers quickly subdued everyone. Edward, already fading, felt his vision blur. He could sense his sight slipping away. The weight of pain and loss began to overwhelm him. "No, no," he whispered, fighting to stay conscious. "Laurie, stay close to me." But the world around him began to dissolve, and he collapsed, losing consciousness just before he could feel Laurie's arms wrap around him. Still, in his mind, moments began to flood back like a rushing river. He remembered the days when Laurie was just a little girl, laughing and playing at the park, her hair sparkling in the sunlight. The time he'd spent not savoring each precious moment with her gnawed at him. He thought about all the chances he had missed, telling stories, playing hide-and-seek, or simply holding her hand as they crossed the street. The pain of not having done those things was now unbearable. In the darkness that enveloped him, a vivid image of Laurie appeared, her small face lit up by a smile, her eyes shining with joy. "I love you, Laurie." The thought echoed in her mind, as if she could communicate with her from a distant place. "I'm sorry for not being there." Meanwhile, the situation in the living room was escalating quickly. Laurie rushed toward Edward just as the police began to arrest them. She kneeled beside him, tears falling onto his face. "Please, wake up. He can't leave you like this." Her voice trembled with desperation as she held him tightly, feeling the overwhelming need to be near him and to not let him go. The police, now in control of the situation, called for an ambulance, aware that Edward needed urgent medical attention. "We need an ambulance here. A man is injured." One of the officers shouted while the rest of the team kept a close watch on the others, ensuring no one tried to escape. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics rushed into the warehouse, ready to help Edward. "Let's go. We need to get him to the hospital." One of the paramedics began to assess Edward while Laurie watched helplessly, her heart aching, unsure of what to do. Finally, the paramedics lifted Edward onto a stretcher, and Laurie took his hand. "I'm here, Dad. I'm here," she repeated, her voice shaking yet full of love. She remembered everything she'd said earlier about missing him and how much Edward meant to her. The light he'd always been in her life was more important than anything Raymond had ever tried to do. As Edward was taken into the ambulance, he began to regain consciousness, hearing Laurie's soft voice beside him. "I love you, Dad," she repeated, and Edward's heart lightened slightly upon hearing those words. He felt a surge of love for her, a love that had kept him fighting even in the darkest hours. "I love you too, Laurie," he replied, his voice weak but sincere. "Sorry for everything. I should have never left you alone." Though his body was battered and weak, his spirit began to lift once more. He knew the fight wasn't over yet, as the ambulance pulled away from the warehouse, taking him toward a new future. The determination to protect Laurie and fight for her freedom reignited within him. The night was still long, and the road ahead was filled with challenges. But Edward was no longer alone. He had Laurie, and together they would face whatever the future held for them. Edward awoke in the hospital after receiving intensive care, to soft light and a peaceful silence. His mind was foggy, but soon he realized Laurie's familiar presence by his side, holding his hand tightly. His heart swelled with relief and love. He was alive, and Laurie was there with him. "You're awake," Laurie exclaimed, tears of joy running down her face. "I've been so worried about you." "I'm okay, my love," Edward replied, his voice still weak but steady. He gazed into Laurie's eyes and felt the connection they'd always shared. "The most important thing is that you're safe," he whispered. "I promise nothing will ever separate us again." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Hector and his accomplices were arrested, and the truth about their role in Laurie's kidnapping and crimes was exposed. The police made sure every detail was uncovered, and Edward finally felt the weight lift off his shoulders. He knew Laurie was out of harm's way. Once he recovered, Edward and Laurie were able to return home. The homecoming was filled with a sense of renewal and hope. The house was decorated with flowers and cards from friends and family, celebrating their return. "This place has never looked so beautiful," Edward remarked, smiling as he looked around, feeling the joy of being back home. He bent down and hugged Laurie tightly. "I missed you every day," he said. "I missed you too, Dad," Laurie replied, her heart full of love. "I knew you'd come back." Time passed, and Edward focused on rebuilding their lives. He was more present than ever, cherishing precious moments with Laurie. Together, they rediscovered the love and happiness they thought they had lost. Edward started getting more involved in his daughter's school activities, helping her with homework, and even taking her on outings. One day, while they were at the park, Laurie suddenly stopped and turned to look at Edward. "Dad, you promised you'd never leave me again, right?" she asked, her face serious, though her eyes sparkled with hope. "I promise, Laurie. I'll never leave you. We're family, and we'll always be together." Edward reassured her, his voice steady, knowing that no matter what happened, he would always fight for her. Life had taken a different turn, but the bond between them had only grown stronger. Laurie often shared her dreams and aspirations, and Edward made sure to support every one of them. He even signed up for painting classes with her, discovering a shared hobby they both enjoyed. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months and years, Edward began to feel more complete. One evening, during a family dinner, Edward raised his glass. "To new beginnings, and to our family," he declared. Laurie joined in, her eyes shining with joy. "To family," she echoed, and everyone toasted to the new life they had built together. The scars of the past were still there, but now they were reminders that brought them closer rather than pulling them apart. Laurie had grown into a bright and vibrant teenager, and Edward was determined to be the father she had always deserved. Together, they faced the world, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, but always certain that, no matter what, they would remain together. Deep down, Edward knew that despite all the hardships they had endured, the love they shared made them unbreakable. They were ready to build a future, and life was waiting for them with open arms. Edward stood in front of the prison entrance, his heart racing. It was a cloudy day, and the air around him seemed to reflect the confusion and pain he felt. He knew he had to face Raymond, the man who had caused so much pain over the years, yet in some way shared a bond with Laurie. After going through all the necessary red tape, Edward was finally led into the visiting room. Raymond sat at the table, looking defeated, though his eyes still held the sharpness of someone who had endured a lot. When Edward entered, Raymond eyed him with suspicion, but his expression soon softened, almost melancholic. "Edward," Raymond's voice thick with bottled-up emotion, said, "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk," Edward replied, sitting across from him. He took a deep breath, gathering the courage he needed. I didn't know about Laurie. I never knew I was her biological father. I just wanted to understand you and apologize for everything that happened. Raymond watched him in silence, his face a mix of pain and confusion. Apologize? Do you think that changes anything? You had the chance to be a father, and I lost my daughter for years, Raymond said, his voice trembling with the weight of his words. I know, Raymond. I'm not here to argue who had the right to be her father, Edward said gently. I'm here because in some way, we need to find a way to understand each other. Laurie isn't just your daughter or my daughter. She's a girl who needs us. Edward's voice grew more passionate. She needs to know we both love her, that we're not at odds, but that we want the best for her. Raymond's gaze dropped to the floor, clearly struggling with his emotions. You don't understand the pain I felt. Watching my daughter be taken from me. I searched for so long. When I found her, things were already so complicated. I just wanted to protect her. And so did I, Edward said, his tone softening. I wanted to do right by her too, even if I didn't know it at the time. I can't imagine the hurt you went through. But now, more than ever, we need to move past it. We need to be the parents that Laurie deserves, Edward insisted, the weight of his words hanging in the room. Edward knew the wounds were deep, but he was determined to give it a try. The day you get out of prison, I want us to sit down and figure out how we can be a family for Laurie. She deserves both parents in her life, and we can find a way to make this work. Raymond looked up, and Edward saw the internal struggle in his eyes. Do you really think this is possible? That we can just leave the past behind? It won't be easy, but if we do it for Laurie, we can try. We can find a way that works for all three of us. That's all I want, Edward replied, the determination clear in his voice. Our rivalry shouldn't influence her life. We need to put our pain aside and focus on what matters most, her well-being. After a long silence, Raymond finally nodded, his expression softening just a little. I never thought I'd have this conversation with you. But maybe you're right, he said. Maybe it's time to try something different. Just promise me one thing, no matter what happens. Let's always put Laurie first, Edward said, feeling a surge of hope building inside him. Raymond met his gaze. The struggle was still visible in his eyes, but there was something else there. I promise. I want Laurie to know who I am and that I never stopped loving her. And I'll do the same, Edward replied. We can be friends, not enemies. He extended his hand across the table. Raymond hesitated for a moment, but then shook Edward's hand, their connection marked by a new understanding. Both were ready to face the challenges ahead, but now they were willing to do it together, for Laurie. When the visit ended, Edward stood up and said goodbye to Raymond, feeling like he had taken an important step. He left the prison with a slightly lighter heart, determined to fight for the family he loved and build a better future for everyone. On the way home, Edward thought about Raymond's words and how everything could change from here on out. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. From that moment on, he was ready to face whatever came his way, especially if it meant securing Laurie's happiness and well-being. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps us motivated to bring you exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next incredible story coming your way. We are so grateful to have you here with us. Now, click on the links appearing on your screen right now. We've got a special selection just for you, packed with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. I'll see you there.